It's time now to take a deeper look at the situation in Iraq and its implications for the rest of the Middle East. ISIL has taken control of a security post along the border with Syria and are now in control of 2 more towns. It is the latest advance in weeks of gains made by the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Our Jane Araf is in Baghdad and joins us now with the latest. Jane.
Thomas, there's growing worry about the ISIL onslaught here into Iraq after the fall of that border post to those fighters. Now, this is a border that is far into western al-Anbar. Anbar is the province with Fallujah, out on the Syrian border near a town called Al-Qaim, which U.S. Marines will be familiar with because they fought fierce battles there in 2004. Now, that has fallen to these fighters, essentially creating a corridor where they can channel fighters and weapons. They've also taken the town of Tel Afar, another place that experienced fierce battles with the U.S. Army. And they are moving in, they have moved into the Beji refinery. Now, the Beji refinery is the biggest oil refinery in Iraq. It takes crude oil and it refines kerosene, gasoline, and the fuel needed to keep electricity plants running. Iraqi security forces fought for that refinery and lost it in the same way that they have been losing territory for over a week to these fighters. This has created a huge refugee crisis, an internal refugee crisis, displaced people, more than 1 million leaving Mosul, and increasing pressure on Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, notably from the United States government, which wants him to sit down with political leaders who he hasn't spoken to in many months in some cases, and come up with a government to help solve this crisis, because this is not just a military security crisis, it's also a deep and deeply rooted political crisis. Thomas?
And Jane, as we learn more about these forces, how is the ISIL different from Al-Qaeda?
The Al-Qaeda that Americans fought here was an organization highly disciplined, very adept into gaining support for a while from the local population and actually taking over entire cities, both through the ruthlessness of suicide bombers, the military ability to fade into the woodwork, to fight in urban territory. This group, the ISIL, is so much worse, according to many officials. Security officials say essentially that this is a group, this offshoot of Al-Qaeda, that has been battle-hardened in Syria. It has access to dozens of people willing to blow themselves up, many of them foreign fighters. It has weapons, including the weaponry and the U.S. tanks and other items that these fighters captured when they took Mosul. In short, it's a far more formidable enemy, and this in a country which does not have the benefit of U.S. forces who were here a few years ago. Now, the United States, of course, is scrambling to provide some help, but it's really limited in the help it can provide, leaving the Iraqi security forces in a very vulnerable position. Thomas?
They seem to be gaining numbers. Our Jane Araf in Baghdad. Jane, thank you. Regional geopolitics are playing a major factor in addition to the U.S. and Britain. Here are some of the other players. Iran is a Shia majority country and needs access to holy shrines inside Iraq. It's also vying with Saudi Arabia for regional influence. Like any country, Iran's leaders don't want to live next door to a civil war. Now, the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, take the opposite view. They want to prevent Iranian influence from spreading any further around the region. Many of ISIL's fighters share the same Wahhabi ideology as the Gulf states. And then there's Israel. Long at odds with most of its Middle Eastern neighbors. Like Saudis, it does not want to see Iran's influence grow, and it also fears instability spreading out from ISIL's base in Syria. I want to bring in now Ali Nadar, who is a senior international policy analyst at RAND Corporation, and Ari Ratner, who is a fellow at the Truman National Security Project. Both are joining us from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, good to have you with us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
As you just heard, there are a lot of regional interests, and I want to start with Iran, Mr. Nadar. What does Iran have to gain or lose in this conflict?
Well, if ISIL takes over Baghdad, this would be a huge loss for Iran. Iran wants to make sure that the Shia-led government in Baghdad, which is friendly toward Iran, remains in power. And importantly, that the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala are not taken by ISIL, which is violently anti-Shia and very anti-Iranian.
Well, as you know, Iran wants a stable and unified Iraq just like the U.S. does, Mr. Ratner. We share the same interest, but could working together lead to a dangerous proposition?
Well, politics often makes strange bedfellows, and in the Middle East that is especially so. I think we have a very complicated relationship with Iran that is at a very pivotal moment, both in terms of what happens in Iraq, but also more broadly, the deadline to reach agreement, at least in terms of the interim deal that was signed earlier, is next month on the nuclear issue between the U.S. and Iran. That is going to have to be worked out over the next few weeks. This situation may help spur agreement on the nuclear issue and on broader issues. On the other hand, it may just be a place where there can be limited cooperation between these two countries, and there may be disagreement as well. So I think it's something we're going to have to see play out.
A lot of unknown questions. Mr. Nader, what about Saudi Arabia's interest?
The Saudis are very worried about an expansion of Iranian influence, and I think theoretically it is possible for the United States and Iran to work together, but there's so many complications, namely the ongoing nuclear negotiations. If Iran and the United States cooperate on Iraq, there is the fear that Iran gains additional leverage on the nuclear issue, and this will make the Saudis, but more importantly the Israelis, very worried because they're under this impression that Iran is on the march in the region. And whether that impression is correct or not, cooperation between Iran and the United States and Iraq could complicate nuclear negotiations. So while it's theoretically possible, I'm not sure if this is the best time.
How much of a working relationship do you think the two will have?
United States and Iran on Iraq? Right now, I don't think they're going to work together very closely. I mean, we've heard reports that there have been some discussions, but I think the United States has been very careful to separate the nuclear issue from other regional issues in the fear of making negotiations very complicated, and I think that has been smart. The problem, though, is if ISIL captures more Iraqi territory and is poised on marching toward Baghdad and taking the capital, then the United States might have to consider working with Iran more closely.
And looking at the region, I spoke about Israel. Mr. Ratner, what role does Israel play?
Well, Israel is certainly worried by developments in Iraq and in the broader region in general in terms of instability in Syria, and certainly in terms of what they view as Iran's increasing hegemony over a number of areas. For Israel, in terms of specific Iraq, the creation of an ISIL enclave in Iraq threatens many countries in terms of potential terrorist activity, and Israel is certainly among those that are potentially at threat. And that's very worrisome from an Israeli perspective. And additionally, it's certainly the case that the Israelis do fear that heightened U.S.-Iranian cooperation, which I agree is probably unlikely, but nevertheless the fear from the Israeli side is that it may come at their expense.
Mr. Nader, looking deeper at the region, at the conflict with these groups, you have Shia, you have Sunni, you have Kurds. The president wants these groups to work together. How do you bring President Obama, how do you bring these groups together for a common goal?
I'm not sure you can at this point. The Prime Minister of Iraq, Maliki, has received a lot of criticism, and in a lot of ways he deserves it. He has been highly partisan and sectarian, but we have to remember that the U.S. invasion of Iraq set off or opened a Pandora's box, and these divisions had existed in Iraq for hundreds of years. So it's not just a matter of finding simple policy choices that could bring these groups together. I think Iraq does face the danger of being fractured. It is a relatively new country. It's not even really 100 years old. So I don't think it's so much what the United States can do, it's what the Iraqis can do at this point. And so far the trends are not very promising.
Mr. Ratner, President Obama made it very clear American forces will not return to combat in Iraq, but he's sending 300 military advisors to the region, Army, Navy SEALs. Do you think their advice will be enough to help end the violence?
Well, fundamentally, the violence is going to have to be ended by the Iraqis themselves. It's going to have to take the fight by the central government in Baghdad against the ISL. It's going to have to take, frankly, a more inclusive sense from Baghdad that Sunnis have a place in the current Iraq. America can certainly play a role. These advisors may be able to play a role in terms of specific operations, but there's no military solution to this problem, and there's certainly no American military solution to this problem. It fundamentally has to be settled politically, and I think what we're moving towards, the real question is not does Iraq break up, is whether you have a soft, de facto but not more than that partition of Iraq, or whether you have something much harder. And I think the question of how you create a federal Iraq that accommodates these different ethnic groups and different sectarian groups is something that's going to have to be worked out by the Iraqis.
Mr. Ratner brings up a very good point, Mr. Nader. At what point does the U.S. tell Maliki's government to take responsibility for itself, or is the U.S. too invested?
Well, there have been reports that Maliki is being encouraged to leave by the Iraqi parties, by Ayatollah Sistani, for example, and Iran plays a crucial role in that regard. If Iran applies a pressure to Maliki to leave, then the chances of that increase. But I think that even if Maliki leaves, the question is who replaces him. Will it be another sectarian Shia? I think the politics of Iraq are poisonous. It's not just a matter of one person, Maliki. If another person replaces him as prime minister, to me it's not clear whether that will heal the wounds that have been created over the years.
Is it time for a different administration in Iraq, Mr. Ratner?
Again, ultimately, as the president said, that's for the Iraqis themselves to determine, and I agree with the other guests, these problems run much deeper than Nouri al-Maliki. Nevertheless, it's quite clear that he hasn't played a constructive role. And there is a possibility for someone else to play a constructive role. Who that may be and the timeline in which that may occur is something that's going to have to be determined by internal dynamics. But he's certainly failing to this point, and it is perhaps time for a change.
A lot of people are talking about troop withdrawal, that it was simply too early, looking at the instability in the region and now with this rebel force. Do you agree? Was troop withdrawal too soon in the area, Mr. Nader?
Well, the Iraqis didn't want the United States to stay, so it wasn't just a U.S. choice. And I'm not so sure if the United States had maintained a few thousand troops that it would have really stabilized the situation. I think there's a tendency to offer these simple military solutions. If a few thousand U.S. troops had stayed, if we conduct airstrikes, I think the problem is much deeper than that, and it's more complicated. So even if the United States had maintained troops, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't see the deep instability in Iraq we see today.
Mr. Ratner, moving forward, what should be the right approach?
Well, I think the U.S. approach has to be severalfold. There has to be a diplomatic work fundamentally within Iraq to try and bring the parties together. That's certainly not in the American power, but America has the ability to attempt to bring the sides together and negotiate something in Iraq that is more inclusive and more power sharing. There has to be a military approach, which is fundamentally not going to solve the problem, but nevertheless there is a place for military force in particular areas or particular airstrikes or via an advisory role. And then third and most fundamentally, there really has to be a new regional approach. There's so many different factions, whether it's our Sunni allies, whether it's Israel, whether it's what's occurring in Syria, Iraq, and Iran, that the U.S. needs really a comprehensive regional strategy, and not just the U.S., the entire international community, but only the U.S. is in a position to organize that.
Mr. Nader, your final thoughts on moving forward?
At this point, a final nuclear deal between Iran and the P5+1, the UN Security Council plus Germany, I think will help the regional situation. If the United States and Iran reach a nuclear deal and that is accepted by Israel and Saudi Arabia and the region, even if they don't like the deal, they have to go along with this deal. I think that opens up opportunities for greater stability in the region. So I think the deal or the negotiations that are supposed to end on July 20th are very crucial, and if there's a deal, then we could talk about working with Iran and some of our regional allies on stabilizing Iraq.
It is a fluid situation. A deeper look, Iraq in the region. Ali Nader, Senior International Policy Analyst at RAND Corporation, and Ari Ratner, a Fellow at the Truman National Security Project. Appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.